Good morning, everybody. It's Wednesday, and thank you for joining us today for our Bible talk for today. I don't know what you have planned. For me, it's Wednesday, so I'm hoping to get out on the golf course this morning, assuming it's open, and before the weather comes in later on this afternoon. But I hope you have a lovely day today, and thank you for being with us this morning. Well, there's a lot in this morning's reading, so I'm going to get straight to the point. We're in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 13. Jesus is in his Galilean ministry, telling lots of parables, and a few more in this morning's reading this morning. So, Matthew 13, starting to read at verse 44. Here we go. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy he goes and sells all he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught a fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put the good into baskets, but threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous, and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all this?" They answered, "Yes." And he said to them, "Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out his treasure, what is new and what is old." When Jesus had finished these parables, he left that place. He came to his own town and began to teach the people in the synagogue. So they were astonished and said, "Where did this man get his wisdom? And where are these deeds of power? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother called Mary? And aren't his brothers James and Joseph, Simon and Judas? And are not his sisters with us? Where did this man get all this?" And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor, except in their own country and in their own house." And he did not do many deeds of power there, because of their unbelief. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, 4 sections in here I was going to suggest this morning. There's 2 parables telling the story about treasure, beginning. There's a short parable about good fish and bad fish. There's a funny little bit there about scribes who are old and new, and there's Jesus going home to his hometown, which presumably is Nazareth. I'll try and take them one at a time. Firstly, there's 2 parables about the discovery of treasure. And I think with these parables, you have to remember that Jesus told parables. And no analogy, no parable is perfect. And if you pick it apart too much, it falls apart. And what you're supposed to see with the parables is just look for the blind and the obvious. That's what you're supposed to see. Pick it apart too much and the whole thing falls apart. So with the idea of finding treasure in a field, keeping it to yourself, not telling anybody, hiding it, and then buying the field and making profit on it, on one level, one shouldn't ask too many questions about the financial probity of that. But that's not what you're supposed to ask here. You're supposed with these parables to see the blind and the obvious. And in both cases, you've got someone finding treasure in a field and someone finding a pearl. You've got someone discovering something of massive, massive value and selling everything they had in order to get that. That's what you're supposed to see, the blind and the obvious. And again, what does this tell us about the kingdom of God? The kingdom of God is precious. It's a jewel. It's worth more. It's a thing of the kingdom of God is beautiful. It's a real treasure for us. And actually, in a sense, it's such a treasure that people should effectively sell and give all they have in order to achieve it. And the kingdom of God is such a wonderful thing that, like people selling up everything they had to buy it, actually the kingdom of God is so precious that we should do similar. That actually we should do everything we can, and that we should base our lives actually around the kingdom of God, because it's such a precious thing. So like they sold everything they had to buy the field and buy the pearl or whatever, likewise today we should do all we have and put all our energies into serving God and making sure that the kingdom of God is the treasure that we enjoy too. That's the first thing. Then you've got this parable about fish. That you have somebody has basically a dragnet, and they put a dragnet into the water, and they pull out some good fish and some bad fish, and that's the good fish presumably go into the baskets, and the bad fish go into the furnace. And I suppose it just reminds us really of something that we don't like to think about very often, which is that judgment exists. That in Christian faith and in faith in God. There's judgment in this world. Some people's faith stands the test of time, and some people's doesn't. There's judgment in this world, and there's judgment in the next as well. And the Bible does have this. It's not very comfortable for us, but Jesus talks about the sheep and the goats. There's the wise man and the foolish man. Psalm 1 talks about the godly and the ungodly. And I think we just need to remember that not everybody is the same, actually. I wish they were. But this parable of the fish reminds us that there is such a thing as judgment, as I say, both in this world and in the next. Then we've got this funny little parable, which I have to be honest with you, I'd never spotted before. This whole thing about scribes who've been trained for the kingdom of God. And a scribe training the kingdom is like a householder who brings out good and bad treasure. And I think what it reminds us is that, what Jesus is saying here is that the scribes that were around him at the time, they were expert in old things. They knew things as they were, they knew the traditions, they knew things the way they were. But actually, Jesus is doing a new thing here. And he's saying that Christian scholars, scholars in the kingdom, can bring out both the old but also the new as well. So whereas the scribes that exist at the moment, who he's saying can only do the old stuff, similarly what he's saying is the scribes in the kingdom of God can bring out the old stuff but also the new stuff too. So I think it's no more complicated than that, really. But again, it's a parable. I'll be honest with you, I've never spotted. And then, so you've got those three parables. You've got the bit about the parable, two parables about discovering treasure. And then you've got the parable about the judgment with the fish. Then you've got this fun little bit about old and new scribes and that sort of stuff. And then at the end here, Jesus goes to his hometown, which presumably is Nazareth, and he's not very well received. And in fact, the word they use is actually they were scandalized. Scandalismo, I think, is the word in Greek. The word just horrible. They were scandalized by what he was doing, and they couldn't understand where the power came from, and where did he get this teaching from? And I think the question we could ask is why. And I think there are two things. Firstly, I think you mentioned mother there, and Jesus come back to his hometown. Now, you and I know that Jesus was born of virginal conception, but actually, you can imagine what the tittle-tattle down the street at Nazareth may have said something very, very different. And bearing that in mind, they might have had a very different view of Mary to what perhaps many people would do today. Therefore, Jesus could have had something of a reputation, being not on face on what it must have appeared to be not conceived maritally, shall we say, and that in those days would have had rather more scandal than it has today. So I do think I wonder, I speculate if that could be one reason why they looked down at him in Nazareth. I think the other problem is probably one of over-familiarity. This bloke comes back to town, and just telling everyone he's the kingdom of God, and he's the Messiah and whatever, and people start saying he's the Son of God, and all things that he was saying and doing his amazing things, and you imagine what they must, I remember him, he was at school, I say a kid, that is, I remember, and all this kind of stuff. It's simply a question of over-familiarity. And I think, I do wonder if it's partly the reputation, possibly to do with Mary and Jesus' conception. I do want to speculate that. And the other one is, I think, simply one of over-familiarity. They knew Jesus too well. They can remember the time when he, and all these kind of things, and so on. And I imagine what you'd feel if someone you were at school with that you knew well came back into town making similar claims. So I think it's one of over-familiarity. But I think in some ways, it almost reminds us of the problem that we have in the church today. Because we have this treasure. The treasure is the kingdom of God. I mean, the gospel of Jesus Christ is truly amazing. I mean, it tells us that we have a God who's got it. We have a God who loves us. We have a God who loved us so much he gave his son for us. And I could go on and on and on. The gospel it's a treasure. And it's a treasure, as we've already learned this morning, which is worth selling everything you have to get. It's that much of a treasure. But I think part of the problem we have today is that because we have history, we're almost known too well. The good old Church of England and all our kind of history with the Crusades and Henry VIII, all things we're constantly reminded of, and there've been scandals, and we all know people that don't do it very well, and the good old crusty Church of England down the road, and all this type of stuff, and the church has kind of got here, and I think we suffer somewhat from over familiarity, and I think what we need to do really is to somehow regain that freshness both for ourselves, to regain the fact that we're not just some elderly aunt up the road that likes drinking tea all the time, but actually we have such a treasure in the kingdom of God that, like the people, selling everything they had to get it, it's that much of a treasure. And we need to actually somehow find new ways of proclaiming that, of finding ways of proclaiming that in doing it in such a way that it reminds us that that reminds the people out there that we have a treasure too. So I think we face the problem of over familiarity, which it's about some elderly aunt down the road. We're kind of pretty harmless, but actually, in a sense, we need to regain the fact for ourselves that we have such wonderful treasure. And we need to find ways of proclaiming afresh in our own time that this treasure that we have. Hope that makes sense. So 4 things briefly this morning. Firstly, this parable about the treasure, that the kingdom of God is such a treasure that it's worth giving everything you have to get it. Secondly, that there is the parable of the fish reminds us there is such a thing as judgment. Thirdly, you've got the bit about the old treasure and the new treasure of the household, reminded that the scribes in the kingdom, scholars in the kingdom of God can both bring out the old in traditions, but also bring out the new with the faith. And also that Jesus goes into his town and he suffers from unfamiliarity, over familiarity. And I think we struggle with that. So we need to find ways of being fresh again in our faith and proclaiming it fresh to our generation.